Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome into the Hoon. On the Kaka, I'm co-host Bernard Hickey with Peter Bale, co-hosting over there in Auckland, across the water. Great to see you.
And Bernard, how are you? Have you been coming to town this week? Somebody told me that you come in every Wednesday, and then I thought I see him so rarely, but maybe he does in fact come in every Wednesday. I've been talking to various people who keep an eye on you during the week.
You need to put one of those trackers on me.
Yes.
Yeah.
I've been thought of wearing one of them myself, but I'm always worried about exactly where I would put it on my naked body.
I'm also looking over my shoulder for drones these days. So no, I didn't make it in this week, and I do try, but of course I am now one of these old people who likes to stay close to home and enjoy
to the
life.
Hearth.
Enjoy a simple life of jumping in the sea and walking in the bush. And
have you found much beach class lately?
Oh, a heck of a lot, and it's piling up. It's great. I'll be able to build a house with it soon.
Excellent. Because I've got about a handful, but it just means I'm probably not looking at it or looking enough for it. And what have you been writing about this week, Bernard? I admit, because I've been doing a little project for Business Desk, which if people want to look at it on Business Desk, I think it's open to the general public. It's a CEO index, which is a prize for the top chief executive in New Zealand. But the interesting thing about it is it spans 70 companies and spanned, and now there's 20 shortlisted, but it also spans the public sector as well as the private sector and the listed companies. So it's kind of interesting to do it. But what have you been doing this week, Bernard?
Yeah, I've been thinking about leadership a bit. Obviously, our mandate is to cover, housing, climate, and poverty, and so we don't normally do, justice, crime, the police, that sort of thing. But it's been such a enormous story this week on the revelations about Jevon McSkimming and the problems of leadership and of groupthink, particularly in the public sector where power sometimes lies. And then I've seen from a distance the BBC story of leadership standing aside and thinking about what is the way that a publicly owned or a public institution should operate. Should it protect its own? Should it try hard to keep its own culture going and defend it against attackers? What's the best way to do these things? And I was thinking about that.
Yeah, good. So let's go back for 1 minute, because you're also going to give us a description about what we're going to do today, a little rundown. But on the McSkimming thing, I think you said the right thing to me today when I suggested we might look at it from one aspect. You said, you're not sure at the moment what we could add to it. The thing I would like to add to it at some point, and I've proposed this to somebody to write about it, is what his case, which of course is difficult to do because it's still in the law courts, tells us about the pornographication of society and the pervasiveness of pornography. And I think there's some of that in the whole don't let kids have access to the internet before and handheld devices before the 16 and so on. But I don't think that the public as a whole or media have really grappled with the significance of that. And there is a depressing sadness in the comments that came out from him and some of the evidence about his reliance on it. But from a political point of view, Bernard, this is pretty rotten, isn't it? I mean, it's that whole nonsense about the fish rotting from the head, though I assume it does. It's a pretty bleak perspective on the police, isn't it? We're not going to add much value to the story, but it is a pretty bleak perspective on the police leadership, isn't it? And especially after the Tom Phillips case, the fraudulent or fake breath tests. It's a bit bleak about one of our key institutions, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it says a lot about power and how people in power like to keep it, and power breeds power. People work in teams, and they tend to work in serial. You bring up the people behind you who you'd like to be with you. And when that power is threatened from outside, from someone who's weaker, to be honest, then you use the arms of power to keep it. And that's what we've seen. And it's sort of awful.
It is interesting because we've seen it in the military before. I think in New Zealand, we've certainly seen it in the. I mean, there's a Masonic element. I don't know whether these chaps are Masons, but there's a Masonic element generally to it. I mean, of course, the UK, the London police have always had terrible problems with Masonic influence. But there's a church element here. It's this. I mean, you and I have worked in leadership jobs in media where part of your job is actually to not hire the next person who looks like you.
Yes.
It's to do DEI, Bernard, but it is actually really just to think a bit more broadly about the kind of people you're bringing up, rather than bring up a bunch of identikit executives.
Yeah, groupthink is dangerous, and also seeing the institution as something that needs to be protected and identifying yourself with the institution as exactly the same thing is also dangerous. It's awful because we've been here before, for those who've been around for 20 or 30 years. And I came into what was then the Dominion back in 2003-4, right in the middle of the Louise Nicholas case, where the Dominion played a huge role in exposing the men who had abused Louise Nicholas, the police officers, and who had done something very similar to what's happened here to protect themselves. And it really emphasized to me the really important role of the media in making sure that there is another institution to hold power to account. And that's what we actually have seen, and it worked in the last year, because it was not a sure thing this was going to come out.
No, I think that's true. But just let me also say, from a journalistic point of view, so because you're going to let me do a soliloquy about the BBC and its implications for us, I think, after we've done your intro to what we're going to do today. But this that earlier case, I think, has been referred to or alluded to in the papers, but I have not seen a single, like a nut paragraph. So did you say that was 2004? 2004?
2003-4, yeah.
Okay, so that's 21 years ago. Why, there's an assumption when we mention that case in our stories that people know. Why would anybody under 30 or under 35 know anything about that case? So I just think that this goes back to my point that we've talked about quite a lot, and that we try to do a little bit on the Hoon, is have a bit more context. Even a nut graph which says, it goes back to the 2004 case when this happened, and here's what the result of that was. Or, as Jeff Jarvis from New York University would say, click out to send them somewhere to find out the information. But I find that frustrating constantly in New Zealand journalism, that we can't go to the origin of the story. We just think everybody knows.
Yeah, and there's also this myopic, what was really important is what's happening right now and what's just happened, when actually it does pay to zoom out. And we'll do that today on the show.
Yes.
We'll zoom out a bit.
Here you go, Bernard.
Starting with Catherine Dyer coming on shortly to talk about what's happening at the COP, and also the government's approach on many of our climate policies and how it's getting called out a bit at the moment, which is good to see. We may or may not have Robert Patman. He's experiencing.
He's driving somewhere, I think he said, isn't he?
Yes, and it's possible that he may not be on, but that's okay. That gives us some time, perhaps, to get into some of the issues cropping up in the United States around Michael Wolff, a former guest on the show, and then we'll speak to Max Rashbrook, the independent social and economic and political analyst who is part of the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis, who've just come up with a really interesting idea on KiwiSaver. So plenty to talk about. But I'm curious, you mentioned, Peter, the need to zoom out and to put things into context. One of the big stories overseas hasn't had a huge amount of attention here, but really matters, not just from what Donald Trump is doing, but also from a public media point of view, because we have some public media still left here.
We do.
A bit. Tell us about the BBC and and the lessons for
Well,
TVNZ
I think there are
and
lessons, and it
RNZ.
was funny, Bernard, because I've been out down to Pukekohe today and had been driving around, but it took me about 15 minutes to write, 10 minutes maybe to write the thing I sent you to today, and then I thought, Jesus Christ, I should have actually done that properly as a Substack entry, because sometimes it is the things you do, I wouldn't say off the top of your head, but I think there are. So the BBC is in a state of crisis, as it occasionally is. It can be an extraordinarily inward-looking and self-destructive organisation, and there are also many people prepared to bash it over the head whenever they get the chance, particularly on the right, or if you're Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, people who've been to some extent exposed by it in the past. And the lessons that I'd like to mention, so that it's not completely irrelevant, kind of refer to TVNZ and Radio New Zealand. I mean, it is we have two public broadcasters. I never say, as the Herald will frequently do, state broadcasters, because they're not. They're companies, organisations with a mission endowed by us or endowed by the government on our behalf to give us straight information and to reflect New Zealand society. One of the things that worries me, and it worried me for a long time since I've been back, is that John Key, I think it was, got rid of the charter between the government and TVNZ. There's no overruling, overarching document that says what TVNZ is there for. And I think news is the critical aspect of TVNZ being a public broadcaster, or having the social license, as it were, to be a public broadcaster. And I think their cuts to news have put that at risk. It's very interesting seeing the way they're being sued by Tallies, which is an ongoing defamation case, which I won't go into for obvious reasons. Radio New Zealand does still have a charter with the government, or a charter that sets it up. The first one is that it is an independent public service broadcaster, and its purpose is to serve the public interest. So, it constantly, and I'm sure Paul Thompson and the other people who run it think about that public interest, if not daily, then weekly. The fourth one is that it's supposed to provide reliable, independent, and freely accessible news and information. And of course, that's very similar to the founding principles of the BBC, which is to inform, educate, and entertain. The critical thinking aspects are what worries me about this, that there was a lack of rigor in so if I can just explain, one of the things that the BBC is alleged to have done, and in fact has clearly done, is its excellent Panorama magazine show, not a news show, magazine show, spliced not two different speeches, but spliced elements of the same speech from January the 6th. And they did it without doing what in text journalism you would do, is put in ellipses or some sort of, and then, because no one doubts that Trump incited that riot. The language was I was going to say bucolic, and that's not the word I'm looking for. The language, yeah. Very, very, very bombastic, and no one doubts that also Panorama was not shown in the United States. It's not visible in the United States. It had no influence. It was a stupid piece of editing that was actually so simple to fix, because it doesn't really matter whether he said, and we're going to go down and fight like hell. It needed a bump of some sort, a visual bump to say, flick, here we go. And I think that's something that I hope people we know, Phil O'Sullivan and others at TVNZ, are doing, reflecting on their editorial processes and controls to try and avoid these unnecessary crises. And the BBC tends to get itself into these crises. But Trump was impeached. There were several inquiries which said he'd incited the January 6th riot. The speech itself was very cynical, in the sense that we're going to go down and see our brave congressmen and women and support them in this effort. And within a couple of hours, people were going through the Capitol looking for Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi. It was a deeply cynical performance, and the message was clear. So I think that we also need to think that the dossier, the documents on which this latest row has been generated, that it is a generated row, And without being too conspiratorial, the subtext is actually about the BBC's coverage of Gaza. And it is a cabal or a group of people, not a cabal, that's a group of people, some of whom are on the BBC board, who have for the last 2.5, 3 years complained about the BBC's coverage of Gaza as being unfair or inappropriate or unfair to Israel. And that is the true subtext to what's going on here, in my view, and that it's extremely difficult to bring that out. But that's really what's been going on here, which does not mean that the edit was right. It doesn't mean that there might not be bias there in certain elements. But as Deborah Turness, the woman who resigned as chief executive of the news department, said, there is no institutional bias there. And in fact, there is a risk that the institutional bias is on the other side. And there's certainly a belief that the institutional bias is being too pro-Israel. Now, this is the other lesson possibly for New Zealand, is that you cannot then solve that by doing both sidesism, that you give equal weight to every opinion. And the BBC's already been through a saga of this with, and they've improved it tremendously. But some years ago, and you sort of hear this occasionally in New Zealand, where, for example, a medical expert or a scientist will have to face up to, with getting given almost equal time to a campaigner or a mother who's lost her child to autism or something like that. And so you set up these false equivalences, and I think you've got to be really careful about that. On the billion-dollar suit that Trump has threatened, and I've read the legal letter this afternoon, and it's not Clarence Darrow. It's much more of a sort of feisty mafia lawyer. I talked overnight to a friend of mine, Mark Stevens, who's one of the leading media lawyers in the world and free speech lawyers in the world in London. We would have had him on, but he would be it's about 4:00 in the morning in London. The UK statute of limitations on defamations expired on October the 24th, so he's too late. He could sue in the US because they have a 2 or 3 year limitation, but as I said, Panorama was not shown in the United States. It also he would also have to pass a test of whether it's substantially true, and I think we know that might be rather
Good
difficult.
fun. Yeah. I'd like the discovery process for that.
Yeah,
but
and we've also talked about incitement and so on. And there is a thing called the Brandenburg threshold, which I hadn't heard of until Mark told me about it. And it's from, all of this is based on case law to some extent, and interpretation of the First Amendment in the United States. But the Brandenburg threshold is about to what extent is someone inciting actual violence in a particular piece of commentary that could then lead to allegations that they were inciting, and I think he's running pretty damn close to that. So I don't think it's feasible. But also, if you think about the weirdness of a president of the United States suing the public broadcaster in the United Kingdom, and when Robert comes on, hopefully we'll talk a little bit about Trump's latest interference in Israel today, which is to write a letter to the president suggesting that he, rather firmly, that he pardon Bibi Netanyahu. This is unheard of, this kind of interference. One thing that's also happened today, and this is where Trump has to be very careful, is we know, probably everybody who's watching this, there has been several huge tranches. They're not leaked, they've been released by US congressional sources, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. Thousands of new emails and exchanges with Jeffrey Epstein and others. Michael Wolff, as we know, is countersuing Melania over one of these billion-dollar suits. But interestingly, he comes in those Epstein emails today, as I know he knew he would, where he is appearing to give advice to Epstein on the phrases to use, how to present his pitch to Trump. But it also suggests that Epstein may well have been in contact with Trump way after Epstein, Trump said he had nothing to do with him. So, it's all a bit uncomfortable. But I think that we need to be really careful about piling on to the BBC and thinking also what we would do without TVNZ and RNZ, which is not to say that they're perfect. And I think I hope they're doing a really good review of their processes without wimping out.
Yes, it's sad in a way that our public institutions are having to be almost preemptively defensive against attacks from bad faith actors, usually, but it still has to be done. So that's right.
Yeah, and also just to be one, it's not, I mean, I'm not particularly on the left or anything like that. It's not left-right for me. It's about news and the importance of news. Somebody's just said, isn't it about who bought the Telegraph? Nobody's bought the Telegraph at the moment. It is completely in suspension because a company called Redbird IMI bought it and was then rejected by the government because it had UAE involvement. So Redbird, the other half of Redbird, is now trying to buy it. It's a newspaper in flux. Forgive me, Catherine. Speaking of flux,
Catherine, lovely to see you. Thank you very much for coming in. We might have a little bit more time with you today because there's a chance that Robert may not be able to make it onto the show, unfortunately, because of travel commitments. Catherine, you wrote an excellent piece that was published this week in the conversation about COP30, which has started in the last few days.
I just decided also, because we talked briefly about McSkimming, that this is in fact turning into a COP show.
Ah, very good. I wasn't expecting that segue, nice. but here we go.
Do go ahead, Catherine. Sorry,
Catherine, it's a very, very excellent piece, which I'll link to in the show notes that you've produced for the conversation about the New Zealand delegation in Brazil, Belém, for COP30, and the questions now about New Zealand's ongoing commitment to the Paris Agreement. Could you give us a sense of where we're at?
Yeah, so a lot of what was in that piece related to some of the conversation that we had last week about the changes in law that the government put through late in the evening, one night last week. So that was changes to delinking the emissions trading scheme from our NDCs, or nationally determined commitments, which are our Paris Agreement commitments for 2030 and 2035 and so on. And just, how that backs into the, they have pretty much demolished most of our climate policy architecture over the last couple of years. And the thing that was left standing was the emissions trading scheme. And now they've basically crashed that as well. And so there is a real question mark over, what the government's plan is for meeting its Paris Agreement commitments, particularly our 2030 commitments, which include quite a high level of offshore mitigation that we had planned into that. So, and so there's a real question mark now about what their plan actually is, and I think they have been far from transparent and clear about what those plans are. And in trying to cut some of the Climate Change Commission advice out of the process, that's also kind of aimed towards not being forced to admit why they're not taking the Climate Change Commission's advice and not coming clean with the public about what's going on.
There's a lot of not coming clean, isn't there? I mean, I even heard what our climate minister saying, I'm pretty sure that other people here are going to want to dialogue with us about our actions. And he's just, they're this is kind of a long surrender, or a
soft
giving
renege,
up when you're not really giving up. Soft what?
Yeah. A soft renege
is
the term I used in that article.
Good on you.
Yeah.
But carry on about what a soft renege is, because that's just so interesting that they're just going to let this slip away and hope bigger countries take the heat, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're hoping that they won't get called out on it. So what they're doing is they've eradicated all of basically the compliance mechanisms or the policy tools that would help us to reduce our emissions and meet those obligations. They're taking that away, but at the same time they're saying, oh, no, it's all okay. We're still going to make it. And a lot of where that gap was being hidden was around this offshore mitigation. And so it was quite revealing when they delinked the emissions trading scheme from that, because that kind of removed an obligation to use offshore mitigation in order to meet at that 2030 target.
Do you want to just elaborate on what that meant? That because you had a little, not a snitty, but a little, not a dig. You wanted to correct me today about my criticisms of James Shaw for relying too much on carbon trading. But that's when you say offshore mitigation, that means spending $18 billion on overseas on buying forests, right?
Okay, so a couple of things. One is that there are 3 or 4 different mechanisms that the government could use to do offshore mitigation. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to use that international carbon market. But most of the other ways that they could use require quite a long time to get put in place, and they haven't made any moves towards doing that, and that was getting quite urgent when the government changed after the last election. So one thing they could do, for instance, is they could go and make a direct arrangement with another country to undertake mitigation reduction in that country, and then claim the emissions reductions here. And so one example of that is, for instance, I think it's Switzerland has bought electric buses for Bangkok, Thailand. And then Switzerland will claim those emissions reductions in their NDC rather than Thailand claiming them. And so that requires actually that you have a specific action plan for how you're going to reduce emissions in that country, that you have agreed it with that country, that you've made the investments ahead of time, far enough ahead of time to be able to bank the emissions reductions and then claim them. And so that takes years for most of those, bigger kind of projects, and the real projects like that are actual fossil fuel reduction.
Yeah, so it's not a terrible thing to try to do.
It's not a terrible thing to try to do, and it's a way to support global south countries as well. Like there's quite a few projects going on in the Pacific, for instance, around renewable energy that we could have done more of and supported that way. So, there are things that we could have done that don't involve just buying cheap forestry carbon emissions reductions through an international market. So the other thing is that was the main intention, I think, when that law was put in place. Now, the international carbon market was supposed to be a backstop, so that's kind of the last resort for any remaining emissions that you hadn't quite managed to soak up with either domestic emissions reductions or those international ones. And I should point out as well that when we first signed up to that 2030 NDC, 2/3 of it were going to be done with offshore mitigation. And in the last couple of years of the last government, there were a whole lot of efforts that went into domestic mitigation, particularly through the GITI fund, that changed that calculation.
What's the GITI fund, Catherine?
The GITI fund, was the GITI, yep. And that was the money that came in from auctioning, from emissions trading scheme auctions. And then it was spent supporting big industrial projects to reduce emissions. So where was I on that? So, and those projects combined reduced our reliance on offshore mitigations from 2/3 to a half. And if we had continued along that path, we could have reduced it a lot more by focusing on domestic mitigation. So there was a lot more work to be done there, and we could have really reduced our exposure to things overseas through that mechanism, and secondly by getting it involved in those international projects. We haven't done either of those things, and so that leaves us really highly exposed to an international carbon market price. And that is problematic because, I think I'm not a big fan of the international carbon market that is being developed at the moment. Right before the last COP meeting, there was a whole lot of big purchases of rights to land in countries in Africa, for instance, by Emirati princes, so there was all this stuff going on where they were trying to get control of forested land in developing or in global south countries. And there were already issues being pointed to in terms of you don't have free, prior and informed consent to do anything with that land from the people who currently live there and whose livelihoods are based there. We have seen a lot of land grabbing going on in the name of carbon emissions reduction projects in the past in developing countries. So there have been all sorts of issues. There's been issues of fortress conservation, which is where you end up militarizing the whole zone of these forests by putting armed guards in there, often to evict or exclude the people that used to live there. So there's all of these big issues. And last time that we had an international linkage to a carbon market in New Zealand, which was during the Key government, we ended up buying a whole lot of hot air from which were emissions from.
We've got plenty of that. I thought we were.
We have a lot of our own of that.
Yeah.
But this was supposedly emissions reductions from the Ukraine and Russia that were not actually emissions reductions. They were just over allocations of allowances within the EU system. And we had no problem with doing that at the time because our consideration tended to be if it was cheap and if it achieved our budgets, we didn't care where it came from. And that was alongside of a moral approach that was... we need to be seen to be doing something, but we don't really care if we're actually doing something or not.
Sorry, you mean that's our moral approach now, or what?
Well, that's what it was in the past. It took us a long time after we de-linked from those Kyoto era international markets to get some real integrity back into our own emissions trading system. And then the last government did some stuff towards in the last year where they eroded that trust and caused a bit of a crash in the market. And now we've got another big crash in the market.
Yeah.
And it's because, the people involved in that market don't trust politicians to not interfere and to do things that will alter the value of their carbon units. And so, carbon trading altogether internationally tends to invite a lot of political interference. And that international market in particular, I'm not convinced yet that under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that they have got those markets to be sufficiently robust and to have sufficient integrity in them to not just cause another round of hot air,
Catherine, just one final one from me. Just pulling back and looking at the big picture here, there's a part of me that's sort of shouting at the government, can't you see? We can all see here. It's a bit of an Emperor's New Clothes moment, really.
Yep.
But they seem to be happening all over the world. People saying, yeah, I am doing something. And we're all going, well, no, I can see you're not. I'm wondering, where is the accountability? In your piece, you argue that, this is going to hurt our international reputation. And it definitely will with some countries and some people in some countries. But there is no real international mechanism to punish the non-performers, the outliers, who now include the United States. There's no army to march in and force you to pay. There's no court which everyone has signed up to that says, yep, if I don't pay, it's going to cost me X billion and I've staked my kid's life on it. There's just no accountability. Could they just carry on doing this and get away with it?
Yeah, one of the problems we've got is we've got a sovereign state system internationally, which means that countries, in order to be bound by any kind of international law or agreement, have to consent to it. And if they don't consent to it, then you don't have any power. That's just kind of the way it is. So unless we change our international system of sovereign state governance, then you are pretty much reliant on consent-based agreements. Now, what's supposed to work in the Paris Agreement is that you are supposed to have transparency or sunlight, which is, if everybody can see what you're doing, then that creates pressure for countries not to perform the way they're supposed to or the way that they said they would. And that's the bit that's, if you get enough countries starting to pull back or starting to renege or slow down on their commitments, then that creates a bit of cover for other countries to do the same.
Yes, but that's exactly.
And so that's where the transparency starts to fall over as well.
We're going to be slow not followers, as you say. What did you call it? Slow reneging.
Yeah, soft reneging.
Soft reneging. I think we have to get this extremely experienced and clever minister on, Mr. Watts, because I don't think this is being reported. I mean, apart from your piece in the conversation and the fact that we try and tackle this every week, I'm not sure that this is being reported strongly enough as to the agreements that we are resiling from.
Yeah, I have seen a couple of good pieces out there, but they don't seem to. They never make it onto the front page, and they don't. They're not really being pushed as a commentary by the media that those reporters work for. So that, yeah.
Do we actually have any New Zealand reporters working for a New Zealand organisation who are actually in Belém in Brazil, covering COP30. I haven't seen anyone at this point.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a name that I can add, but I don't have
No.
Come
anybody
back,
else.
Rod Oram, all is forgiven,
Well,
unfortunately.
this is the extraordinary thing. One of the
Yeah.
They don't have
biggest
the funding.
events in climate change, public diplomacy, international relations is going on in Brazil, and there are New Zealand officials there, there are ministers there, there are lots of NGOs, but there is no independent journalist there because the two main privately run news organizations do no longer have specialist climate reporters, and even if they did, they would not and could not and won't afford to pay for them to go.
Well
And
put, Bernard.
This is a big part of what erodes that transparency that we need to see, and of course, it's not just happening here.
I reckon the
in
three of us
Aotearoa, it's happening
with our lovely
internationally.
producer, we need to think about a special show on this. So, just because the audience is occasionally saying that, I'm pushing you too much on various things, Catherine, but the way you've described, I think sometimes we've got to get back to the core problems here. Is that this, and you do it so beautifully with slow reneging.
Thank you very much. We will capture this phrase. It'll be in a headline. I appreciate it, Catherine. Lovely to see you. And it's time now to welcome into the show Max Rashbrook from IDEA.
Hey, Max.
Great to see you, Max, from the Institute for Democratic and Economic Analysis. Lovely to have you on the show again, Max.
It's a pleasure to be here, Bernard.
Now, let's start with Kids KiwiSaver, which is fresh today, an idea you've been working on and put out with IDEA. What's the idea here?
Well, look, so the nub of it, Bernard, is two things, I guess. We faced a savings deficit as a nation. I think that's pretty well accepted. And then the other thing is there's an awful lot of people who get to age 18 with very little behind them, no real savings, no real sort of financial foundation. And so we just thought a really simple, pragmatic way to try to start to deal with those problems would be to have a Kids KiwiSaver scheme. And, it's relatively straightforward. Enroll every child in KiwiSaver at birth, have the government match sort of parental savings and/or make payments directly to lower income families, see those amounts accumulate over time, and by the time you've hit 18, hope young people have got something substantial behind them that's the basis for their future savings journey.
Yeah, because there are some precedents, some ideas that have been out here on this, and also some discussion politically here. Could you talk about some of the international examples and, where the main parties currently stand on this?
Yeah, so there's a few of sort of schemes that are a little bit like this. They sometimes go under the heading of asset-based welfare. 20 years ago, the UK Blair government had a go at setting up things called child trust funds, which were broadly similar and which saw quite a big increase in savings for poorer children in particular before they were wound back by the subsequent Conservative government. In the US, there's growing momentum behind these kinds of schemes. They call them baby bonds. It's very American, but it's the same kind of principle.
But they're very private, aren't they, Max? They're not mandated, right?
No, not the sort of the baby bond schemes are being run by the states. And so, like Connecticut, for instance, is depositing like quite a good chunk of money into the savings accounts for poorer children, for children who are eligible for Medicaid, I think it is. So there's precedents like that. And then closer to home, for I think 14 years or so, Ngāi Tahu has been running a scheme called Whairawa. Same sort of principle. If Ngāi Tahu families, whānau, put in, a couple of $100 a year for their children, Ngāi Tahu matches that, or more than matches it, actually more than dollar for dollar.
Amazing.
And that's building up savings for those kids when they turn 16.
One solves a problem of generational wealth in Maoridom as well, or starts to solve a problem with generational wealth in Maoridom, doesn't it?
Yeah, it could do. And look, the way we've sort of modelled the scheme, it depends how you set it up and the numbers, but plausibly young people could be hitting 18 with $10,000 to $20,000 accumulated in their accounts. And when you think that we live in a world where sort of the median wealth for someone who's Pākehā is about $220,000 from memory, but for Māori it's $50,000.
Yeah.
Obviously, any savings like that from an early age are going to make a much bigger difference to the ethnicities who have the least at the moment.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, could you tell us about, the political possibilities of something like this happening? Because, we often get fantastic big ideas for new reforms and taxes and structures and things, and everyone looks at each other and go, yeah, that'll never fly in MMP. But what's the current situation around an idea like this?
Well, one never knows, but I'm cautiously optimistic for a couple of reasons. One is because a scheme like this, the magic is the compounding interest over time. The amount you'd have to spend on it as a government in the first year would be pretty manageable. We've costed it somewhere between $20 to $80 million in the first year. Obviously, that cost increases with time, but that's manageable, and it's something that you could even do in a cost-neutral way by rescoping adult KiwiSaver contributions and freeing up a little bit of money from that. And I think also, I think as a scheme, it builds on KiwiSaver, which is pretty well loved. There's, better than anyone, Bernard, there's this huge debate about savings and KiwiSaver, and maybe should KiwiSaver be compulsory? And I think this is really complementary to all of that. And also it's got elements, it's about thinking about the future, it's about responsibility. You could weave it into financial literacy education. I think there's a lot of things in this that speak to people reasonably widely across the spectrum. We had politicians from several different political parties across the spectrum at the launch today. So yeah, I'm reasonably optimistic.
Because New Zealand First has suggested in its 2014 election campaign that all children be enrolled at birth with a $1,000 kickstart. They haven't seemed to talk about it much lately, but it seems to me like one of these policies that could accidentally crop up in a coalition form and negotiation and turn into one of those, those things that actually happens out of nowhere.
Yeah, I think that'd be lovely. And yeah, it's something that New Zealand First has been interested in. It's something that the Greens have been interested in the past. Look, and, Nicola Willis said a couple of months ago, any party that wants to be taken seriously next year is going to have a really serious KiwiSaver policy. So I think it's something where there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of different ideas about KiwiSaver bouncing around. And so we've just, we're inserting our idea into that sort of debate that's already pretty vibrant.
Over to you, Peter.
Max, good on you having such an imaginative idea. And we had, of course, Sam Stubbs on, I think only a week ago or 2 weeks ago, talking about his KiwiSaver idea for infrastructure. Could you elaborate on a couple of things that I've always, since coming home, I've always found rather perplexing about KiwiSaver, which is its lack of tax deductibility in any way, really, and the sort of inefficiency of it as a result of that. It doesn't work like a UK ISA system does, which is an individual savings account. How would you? What is there? Is there an optimal structure that could be adopted without it being too distortionary? Because part of this is the legacy, as Bernard sometimes talks about the Douglas era, when you got rid of all the distortions in the economy and subsidies and so on. But how could we turn KiwiSaver into that kind of generator of long-term wealth?
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting question, and I think it is a complicated one where people will sort of reasonably have different views on it. The thing about KiwiSaver is that the returns that are generated inside KiwiSaver are taxed in a way that they mightn't be in other countries. And look, in the report we've modelled versions where the kids' KiwiSaver returns, at least up until 18, would not be taxed. That is one option, and obviously then your savings do accumulate at a greater rate. The big issue for me about making savings tax-free is who's going to take the greatest advantage of it, all things being equal, is people with lots of savings, and that's wealthy people. So tax exemptions do risk being very expensive and very regressive, and I actually think that's a problem that the UK has. This huge spending, the pension tax discounts, which go to very well-off people. That's not to say you couldn't find, you could sort of cap parental contributions into kids' KiwiSaver to stop, very wealthy families taking, undue advantage. while having the tax-free element of it. You could do that. It is a finely balanced conversation, is what I would say about that.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting, Matt, because you mentioned two of my favourite words there, which was financial literacy, and I'm not very good at it myself, but I recall seeing somebody very close to me lecturing my daughter on a beach about interest rates, bonds, what an equity is, and that child now has a very substantial nest egg and takes responsibility for their but to a huge extent for their financial well-being. I mean, I think you and Bernard could form quite a powerful, or maybe we can do it with the Hoon, quite a powerful financial literacy communicator, because it is about being comfortable with the idea of, as you said, compound interest, that kind of thing. What is a bond? Sharesies, I think, helps with this a lot. I mean, just to tell us a little bit more about that financial literacy aspect before Bernard then tackles you on another question, please.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think we need a lot more financial literacy as a country. I think, the sort of investment practices are being democratized through things like Sharesies, and I think that's really valuable. But obviously that even the knowledge there, the ability to take advantage of that isn't very evenly spread. So I think the government's move towards making financial literacy compulsory in high schools is sensible. And our pitch with Kids KiwiSaver is simply imagine how much more powerful those curriculum lessons would be if every child in those high school classes knows that they have a KiwiSaver account that's accumulating for them already. I worry that otherwise financial literacy classes will seem pretty abstract. Money management classes for children who may think they will never have any money to manage would be very different if they have actually got those accounts building up for them.
Yes, it's very much like the idea of giving the vote to 16-year-olds so that their first vote is something that they work on as a class project in their last couple of years of school. And you could do the same with financial literacy and everyone's KiwiSaver account. It also, connects everyone up to the IRD system quickly. And if you were clever about it, you could use it as a way to distribute state funds in a crisis, which we didn't really have during COVID in some way. And if you were being really, really clever, you'd use it as a tool in monetary policy. But let's not get into that. Max, you wrote a really interesting column this week on the spin-off, which we'll link to in the show notes, about this idea of the framing of government debt and the idea that the government is just like a household. And when times are tough, it needs to tighten its belt. Now, the natural response, I think, from anyone who thinks about the economy and has done the study will say, well, but it's not like a household. And then, bang, you lose the argument. What do you think about this current framing and a way in which the left, if you like, could do a jujitsu move on the whole government like a household?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. That's a really nice way to put it. Yeah, look, it's a tension because you're absolutely right. I mean, a government in some profound ways is not very much like a household, and the most obvious one is in a recession when households are contracting their spending. You need the government to do exactly the opposite, very basic Keynesianism. But I think the problem is in discourse more generally when someone like Nicola Willis says, look, everyone's doing it tough. Households are tightening their budget, they have to live within their means, so do we, and that's why we need to get spending down, that's why we need to get public debt down. That really resonates with people because they understand their own household finances and they understand that they have to live within their means. And so when people on the left, even though they're sort of intellectually correct, embark on a long disquisition about, well, no, there's this intergenerational equity component and, well, actually, counter-cyclical fiscal policy and all that and the other, they just lose the argument because explaining is losing. And people just think, oh, these guys don't sound like they understand household economics, and they seem very divorced from what I know to be the way that the world works. And so what I was saying in the piece is that although this will stick in some people's throats, I think you probably actually have to, for a lot of purposes, accept the metaphor that the government is a bit like a household, but then just say, well, look, households borrow, and for that matter, businesses borrow, and they do so that they're not constrained by their day-to-day income, and they borrow to enlarge their means, so that in the future they'll earn more income, then they can very easily pay off that borrowing that they've made. If households and businesses do it, why shouldn't government?
Yeah, and you could argue that Aotearoa's government is really a bit like the household of the nation. And it is there to try to invest in a house for the nation and a hospital and a school for the nation, and probably needs to borrow and build those things, and is able to pay for them in the long run, because not only does it have its own family's income who are alive today, but the next family's income. And unlike a normal household, and we'd all like this power as a household, I can go outside and force all of the other people outside my house to pay me money. It's great. Now, that's obviously not something you want to talk about if you're a politician, but that's the guts of it. And secondly, there is actually a really clever way to jujitsu the whole government as household here, is to go, okay, if you are worried about the government having too much debt and that it should tighten its belt, think about the government as if it was a household and it had a problem with its kids dying and the house being cold and mouldy and unhealthy, and people in all sorts of pain. And you had the ability to solve that for the long term by going to a bank and borrowing money. And your current situation was that your interest costs, net interest costs, after you'd received dividends and interest from your assets, was actually less than 1% of your total income, disposable income at the moment, which is way, way less than actual households have these days. If anyone's got a mortgage, they've probably, and if they've got a young family, young growing family, they've probably got an interest cost which is more like 30-something% of their disposable income. So you can compare the government to a household and say, actually, we're not very indebted at all. And would you expect your bank to say no? If you went to the bank and said, my interest costs are currently 1% of my income, and I could build this house and save my kid's life, would you lend me the money? And of course the bank would say absolutely. And by the way, would you like a boat and a double cab ute as well? So I think that this is an interesting angle to go for, and also just highlights the issue that politics is as much about framing and what is seen as politically acceptable as anything else.
Well, may I ask you both then a question about that? Because just hearing you, I mean, we seldom let Bernard go fully off on one then, but he did. One of the things that Catherine Dyer, who's our climate person at the top of the show, earlier on the show, talked about was the inconsistency of government decision making, which had really cut a hole in the carbon trading system. It's that kind of inconsistency that then weakens the value over time of KiwiSaver as well. Your think tank is doing some interesting things. I mean, are there kind of 5 or 3 core policies that need to become kind of tropes in New Zealand about, that have bipartisan support somehow across parties, particularly in an MMP environment?
Oh, that's a good question. I think we're probably a bit too fresh to answer that properly. Sort of as a think tank, been going for a year and a half tops, really. So I don't know that IDEA would have a firm view on that, but I think, there are definitely areas where consistency of policy matters the most. And I think, look, this is a very optimistic take, but I think the best case scenario is that we're sort of working towards that around a whole set of things like infrastructure. And, you've covered this before. I think the work the Infrastructure Commission is doing is really valuable and is trying to build a pipeline of projects that are actually properly, rigorously checked, and which you could get some buy-in from across the spectrum. And then obviously that allows you to plan for the long term, build a workforce for the long term. You could then tie onto that, and again, you've covered this, the work the Helen Clark Foundation was doing, saying, well, we need a population strategy, and that population if we think about what that's going to happen in population, the aging population, that's going to change the infrastructure that we build.
Yep.
And then I suppose if you bolted like a third element into it, it would be therefore a workforce development plan, which we have just been calamitously lacking. I mean, it's so obvious, at least how many nurses, teachers, probably tradespeople, dentists, whatever else we need. We haven't done that planning, but if you click those things together, the infrastructure, the population, the workforce, and you could, and I think probably get some bipartisan buy-in to that, then that at least is a bit of New Zealand. I mean, there's still been an awful lot to fix, but that is one bit that would function better, I think.
Max, thank you so much for jumping on there, and we put you on the spot and you came up with a pledge card. Brilliant.
And Max, and great to see you with such an interesting selection of novels and non-fiction on your shelves behind you.
Oh, well, I'm an English literature student originally, so that the novels are very dear to me.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Brilliant, Max. Thank you very much.
Likewise.
And we look forward to seeing you again. And congrats on today's policy proposal. It's good to see someone from outside the political sphere coming up with some new ideas. Brilliant. Cheers.
And Bernard, in my other life as a part-time book seller or bookshop looker afterer, I can recommend Flesh, the book that won the Booker Prize this week. It's looks amazing. So where are we going now? Shall I do my little Robert Patman bit before you do your skateboarding
yes, please.
blog?
Yes, I have a good
the stories
skateboarding blog.
that had we had Robert that I wanted to talk about today, which you and I can do the Robert alternative, the Cook Islands and this row between Cook Islands and New Zealand, where we've suspended our aid to the Cook Islands. Does that give you the impression, Bernard, that it's actually Winston doing a bit of Winston waving there? It's become some kind of slightly strange, slightly pathetic masculine display?
I think it's Winston doing his thing because he can. The Cook Islands are small enough so that if someone was to take offence, they're unlikely to cause grief for us. Whereas if we actually had to go at China, which essentially is what we're doing here.
I see. So it's a proxy.
It's a proxy to push back at China. And there's a lot of people in the diplomatic and security communities who are genuinely worried because, one of the advantages we have is we are so far away from anyone else. It's very difficult to be invaded or attacked because it's just so damn far. But you set up a port at in the Cook Islands, you're a lot closer. Also, if you look at your geopolitics of the history of this part of the world, the Second World War, a large part of it was fought in those island chains that were effectively the connection between Australia and New Zealand and the United States and Asia. And if there was going to be some sort of conflict in the future, it would be in the Solomons. It would be in, the Cooks. It would be in places like
Bernard, that you should say that, because I was out on a boat the other day looking, and I often go there, but the US military base that was on Motutapu, and the construction of the steel harbours and various landing craft and so on that was done on a construction site at Rangitoto should be a really good reminder of how close it can be, because they were all floated up to the Guadalcanal and so on.
That's right. And, we're still very reliant on these connections, particularly into Asia now and the United States. There are many who would argue this will never happen. China would never shoot itself in the foot like this. But certainly once China has that power, it doesn't have to do anything. All it needs to do is threaten. And we're in a bit of trouble because we realize how exposed we are. And anyone looking at our reliance still on now refined oil and gas or refined oil knows how vulnerable we are. To be honest, what I think we should be doing is using all of the amazingly cheap panels and batteries and
I totally agree.
Electric cars.
No, we've been thinking
China
about that. Yep. You're right.
Throwing out there and using that.
Except, of course, I wouldn't have shut down Marsden Point, and I wouldn't have stopped exploring for gas. But that's a different thing. One of the other stories, Bernard, that I wanted to flag up in the Patman session, as we could call it, is the UK declining apparently to share intelligence with the United States about the Caribbean, because they're worried about the legality of the US actions against the alleged Venezuelan drug boats. And France has done the same, saying that this is illegal, and they can't take part. They feel as though that this is going to rebound on them. I mean, I was thinking about this also. The great thing about attacking the drug boats is that nobody loves intercontinental drug missions and drug submarines and so on. And clearly, many of the things that the Americans are attacking are those things, but they're a very unloved bunch of characters. So, but it's very interesting the stresses that it's putting on things like Five Eyes. And then a second Five Eyes story, possibly a third one, is that the UK has apparently cut off, or MI5, the domestic security operation, has cut off cooperation with the FBI because it feels as though Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, the kind of swivel-eyed loon appointed by Trump, reneged on an agreement to keep staff in London who were particularly skilled at the kind of surveillance that is going to be required if the UK, as expected, gives approval to a Chinese super embassy in the Royal Mint in the City of London. I mean, it's very interesting, these kind of flexes. And what interests me particularly in that one is that the story came out of the New York Times, which means that somebody in the MI5 is doing a very good job of communicating with the most important American newspaper. And then I picked up today, Bernard, a little hint from not necessarily the most reliable source that Kash Patel is, on the other hand, concerned about MI6, the foreign intelligence service in the UK, because he's reinvestigating its potential role in the Russiagate inquiry against Trump during the Biden era. So there's some real tensions in Five Eyes, and it's going to be quite interesting to see how that plays out. So maybe we'll have an intelligence person, or an intelligent person next week, and possibly an intelligence person.
Yes, it's quite a crazy era, and it turns out, of course, Epstein's heavily involved here, in that Politico's reporting today that he had been in close contact with Russian sources throughout.
But did you see, Bernard, that he was essentially also a kind of explainer of Trump? He believed he'd been so close to Trump that he was quite useful to them in order to explain Trump's randomness. It's a very interesting intelligence story. Bernard, you've got a Russian skateboarding dog, haven't you?
Yes, I'm hoping that people can see there a video that's about
You're trying to do the video skateboarding dog again.
I know, and only because it's so funny. And this is from Russia, a big presentation showing.
It's pissed. That's the problem. It's pissed, Bernard. Oh, there he goes. He's rushing about. Now, Bernard, you've got to do a verbal version of that, otherwise poor old Simon won't have anything to splice. What happened there? What did we just see, Bernard?
We saw a drunken robot fall over, a Russian one, and it was the funniest thing I've ever seen. And I'll suggest a link.
Christ, that's not good enough, but all right.
Yes,
I think is what you were about to say. Speaking of drunken Russian robots.
Thank you very much, and have a great week, everyone. We'll see you all again next week. Thanks, Peter.
Danger,
Cheers.
Will Robinson, danger. Goodbye.